there, Cinemaster fans! Hope you're ready for some movie magic. Let's dive right in. The movie starts with Dan was in the women's restroom fixing the exhaust fan when, out of nowhere, a dead rat fell from the fan, landing squarely on his face, making him gag in disgust. After barely managing to fix the fan, he rushed to a stall to throw up. Just as he was about to leave, he heard two people entering the restroom. Terrified of being mistaken for a creep, Dan quickly locked the stall door. Two girls dressed in Christmas outfits walked in, chatting non-stop. One of them mentioned she had been bitten by a homeless man, which made Dan curious enough to sneak a peek. What he saw next nearly made him pass out. The girl who had been bitten suddenly transformed into a zombie and attacked her friend, biting her viciously. As blood splattered everywhere, Dan realized he was in deep trouble. He scrambled to call the police, but in his panic, he accidentally dropped his phone into the toilet. The noise caught the attention of the zombie, who began pounding furiously on the stall door. Dan, frozen in fear, stayed completely silent. But to his horror, the zombie started crawling under the stall door and grabbed hold of his pants. Panicking, Dan stumbled backward, and in a twist of fate, his foot slammed down on the toilet lid, sending the zombie straight into the bowl and flushing it away. Dan seized the chance to crawl into the neighboring stall, hoping to escape amidst the chaos. But just as he reached the restroom door, he bumped straight into another zombie. The undead creature, spotting fresh meat, immediately dropped the fried chicken it had been holding and lunged at Dan. In a panic, Dan accidentally triggered the hand dryer, giving him a small window to dash out. However, the situation outside was even worse. The entire place was overrun by zombies. With no other options, Dan retreated back to the restroom, where he let out a desperate, frustrated scream. After all, he was just there to fix a vent, and now he was stuck in the middle of a zombie outbreak. Determined not to let another zombie squeeze under the door again, he blocked the gap with a nearby advertisement board. As the zombies continued to pound at the door, he began using the restroom mirror to reflect his movements, hoping to confuse and divert the zombies' attention. After some clever maneuvering, he finally managed to screw the vent cover back into place. Just then, Dan noticed a phone mounted on the wall. He rushed toward it, ready to call for help when he suddenly remembered. His phone was still sitting in the toilet next door. Reluctantly, he retrieved the soaked device, grimacing in disgust. After giving it a quick rinse, he attempted to dial the security office. He managed to say just a few words before the phone short-circuited due to water damage. Dan's last hope vanished, and his mental state crumbled as frustration and despair overwhelmed him. In the midst of his breakdown, a faint voice called out from the neighboring stall. It was a girl, and through their conversation, Dan learned her name was Heather. She too was trapped in the restroom. Although he couldn't see her face, the sound of her voice led Dan to believe that Heather must be beautiful. Single for 30 years, he quickly became infatuated with the idea of her, even though they hadn't met in person. In his mind, he vowed to protect her and get them both out of this nightmare alive. Heather's voice brought Dan back to his senses, allowing him to focus and start thinking strategically. He climbed over into the neighboring stall, where he found a zombie's torn clothing. Using a severed finger, he fashioned a makeshift slingshot with the intention of hitting the fire alarm. If he could trigger the alarm, rescue would soon follow. Dan tried several times but failed to hit the target. Just as he prepared for another attempt, the bathroom door suddenly swung open. To his surprise, it was the building's security guard, and judging by his appearance and demeanor, he looked highly professional. As Dan fired the severed finger from his makeshift slingshot, it flew with precision, straight into the security guard's mouth, lodging in his throat. The poor guard choked, struggling to breathe, only to be torn apart by the relentless zombies moments later. In his final moments, the guard still managed to express his gratitude toward Dan. Witnessing the tragedy unfold, Dan was consumed by guilt, realizing that the slim chance of escape had been ruined by his own hand. Thankfully, Heather's words of encouragement reignited Dan's determination. He picked up the slingshot once more, but his shaky hands caused another missed shot. However, in a twist of fate, the misfire struck a ladder, sending it clattering down in front of him. Seizing the opportunity, Dan quickly set up the ladder, carefully climbed onto the sink area, and successfully retrieved a tool. Just as Dan was basking in a brief moment of triumph, the ladder slipped, and the hammer from the toolbox tumbled into the sink. Panic set in as Dan scrambled back into the safety of the stall. Though he had returned unscathed, his hard-earned prize amounted to nothing more than some useless cash. Meanwhile, the hammer, now in the hands of a nearby zombie, was wielded with violent force, smashing the glass outside. Watching the chaos unfold, Dan had a flash of brilliance. He began taunting the zombie, luring it toward the stall door. Just as he hoped, the zombie fell for the trick, bringing the hammer to the door and pounding away at it. In a quick move, Dan snatched the hammer back when it got stuck in the door. Feeling like he had finally turned the tide, Dan's relief was short-lived. One of the zombies managed to bite his arm. Convinced he was doomed, he sank into despair, sobbing uncontrollably. But then, in an unexpected twist, Dan started laughing. The bite hadn't broken his skin because the zombie was wearing dentures. With a newfound burst of hope, Dan realized he'd narrowly escaped death once again. The hole in the door makes the zombies outside increasingly agitated. Realizing he can't just sit back and wait, Dan decides to break through the partition behind him to rescue Heather. After some hard work, he finally creates a big enough opening and squeezes through. Following Heather's voice, he finds her position and breaks through another wall, finally catching a glimpse of her. However, her sturdy physique is a far cry from the image he had in his head. Aware of this disparity, Heather outright refuses Dan's help, fearing he will look down on her. Dan quickly tries to explain that he isn't that shallow, but Heather isn't convinced. She opens up about her struggles, sharing how she's often ridiculed for her looks and how tired she is of that kind of life. Just as she finishes speaking, she resolutely opens the bathroom door, and a horde of zombies floods in, tearing her apart in an instant. Dan watches in horror, his heart heavy with grief. This was his first real connection with a girl, and Heather's brutal fate leaves him feeling utterly helpless and heartbroken. After collecting himself, Dan realized he had no choice but to leave the place. He attempted to escape through the ventilation system, but when he opened the vent, he was horrified to find it crawling with zombies as well. With no other options, Dan returned to the safety of the bathroom, only to be overwhelmed with emotion upon seeing a drawing of Heather on the wall. He broke down in tears, mourning her loss. As he wiped his eyes, a sudden idea struck him. Something so absurd it just might work. Dan quickly sprang into action, wrapping himself head to toe in toilet paper, disguising himself as a mummy in the hopes that it might help him blend in with the zombies. After carefully preparing his disguise, Dan gathered his courage and charged out of the bathroom. Amazingly, his toilet paper disguise worked, allowing Dan to pass through unharmed. He made his way through the eerily quiet hallway and managed to reach the elevator. After what felt like an eternity, Dan finally arrived safely on the building's ground floor. Before leaving, he took the time to draw a picture of himself and Heather on the bathroom door. It was clear that, despite everything, Dan had a deep, emotional side. Stepping out onto the street, Dan finds a phone booth and quickly dials his mom, warning her to stay indoors at all costs. But just as he hangs up, he looks up to see the streets swarming with zombies. The phone booth is now surrounded. The movie ends. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to get more new videos. See you next time.